This is a lecture that I've been gave in Kyoto back in the spring, and then in London just a few weeks ago, and then I'll do it again in Chicago in just a few weeks as well. It comes from one of the quotes from the Book of Tea, which I believe is one of my favorites. And this is what Okakura says. Meanwhile, let us sip tea. The afternoon glow is brightening the bamboos. The fountains are bubbling with delight. The sighing of the pines is heard in our kettle. Then let us dream of evanescence and linger in the beautiful foolishness of things. This word evanescence is not a word used very often, and I spotted it in the New York Times not too long ago when they wrote about the passing of a Buddhist writer. So we often see it in Buddhism. Evanescence is, if you can imagine, is when you see a meteor streak across the sky and then it's gone. It's that beauty that all just disappears. It's like sand running through your fingers. You imagine how beautiful the sand is and then it's gone. It's that fleeting beauty that we often find in our life. And tea can be part of that evanescence that we experience on a regular basis. So we often say that the taste of tea and the taste of Zen are the same. So today in this short talk, I'd like to talk about these things. Number one, I want to introduce the life of Okakura Kokuso and the genesis of the Book of Tea. So just how many of you have read or have in your possession a copy of the Book of Tea, which was one of the books almost everyone had who was in the tea world for years. But what I often found is that people read it, but they didn't quite understand it because they didn't understand who Okakura was. So once you understand Okakura, you understand more the Book of Tea. It has never been out of print since it was first published in 1906. It's been translated into at least 40 different languages. You can even get it online as a spoken word for free. So somebody asked, well, why would you do a new edition of the Book of Tea if people can get it for free? It's because I wanted to introduce the book to a new audience. And that's what my intention was when I brought it out a few years ago. And to illuminate the Okakura's idea of teaism, which is a cult founded on the adoration of the beautiful among the sordid facts of everyday existence, which is something we search for every day of our lives. So let's look at how the Book of Tea influenced art and artists, especially in America. Can anyone tell me who did this painting? Georgia O'Keeffe. Without a doubt, the preeminent female artist of the 20th century America. Can you tell me who did this painting? Georgia O'Keeffe. Yes. She did this painting in about 1917, Blue Lines. So how could an artist do both of these paintings? This is the home of Georgia O'Keeffe in Abiquiu, outside of Santa Fe. So about 20 years ago, my wife Shelley and I went to Santa Fe to to take part in the opening of the Georgia O'Keeffe Museum. And we took a tour of Georgia O'Keeffe's home. When we walked through Georgia O'Keeffe's living room, we felt very at ease there. You know how sometimes you enter a room and you think, the spirit about this room is good. I really feel comfortable here. And that's the way we felt about this room. Let's look at some of the aspects of it. As the room takes you where? All the way through that plate glass window, what do you see? You see this beautiful ancient tree out there. So it's tying in the aspect of in Japan, in the spirit of Japan, that the outer and the inner are coming together. Nature that's why they have folding doors, so the house opens up to the exterior. So here you have this beautiful, very simple house that George O'Keeffe lived in. Do you see a lot of bric-a-brac and pictures and family things? No, it's very, very simple. So as we went through the house, we realized too that George O'Keeffe was a tea drinker. And so you see, here is a photograph of George O'Keeffe drinking tea in her kitchen. So we went on a tour to the kitchen, and as we were going towards the kitchen, we went through her pantry. Now I'll say this, if I ever visit your home and I want to know who you are, I can go to two places. I can go to your bookshelf and see what you read, or I can open up your refrigerator door and see what you eat. And I know a lot about you at that point. So this is our opportunity here in George O'Keeffe's home to go to her kitchen. I'm really excited about it as we go through the pantry. And we see, as you up on the top, you see teapots, coffee pots. There were glass jars there with dried peas, dried beans, lentils, all with a hand-lettered masking tape label that George O'Keeffe had put on those. And then I found one that said tea. And I thought, oh, this is wonderful. You know, George O'Keeffe was a tea drinker. Well, right next to it was another jar. You see, George O'Keeffe had not just tea, but next to it she had a jar with good tea in it. There is this moment of enlightenment in all of us who are teists, where we realize, yeah, there's tea, but we're here today, why? Because we are good tea people. It's not an elitist thing. It's just the fact that in this world, we have decided if you have an opportunity to drink tea or drink good tea, we're going to choose the latter. Where does she get that idea? She got it from Okakura Kakuzo from the Book of Tea. Because in the Book of Tea, Okakura, who was an art evaluator, art historian, a museum designer, wrote, "We have good and bad tea as we have good and bad paintings," generally the latter. You see, he was throwing in this little aside, making a comment about the art of the day. But that's where we get the good tea, where she got the idea of good tea, good art. And you know, we even have friends that are friends, and we have friends that are what? Good friends as well. You can carry that on ad infinitum as well. A few years ago, the George O'Keeffe Museum invited me to design a line of teas that they could sell in their gift shops. And so we designed it. It's called Good Tea, and it has this label on it. And we designed teas that George O'Keeffe would have appreciated. So let's look at who this fascinating man, this mysterious man from the East, Okakura Kakuzo, is. When he first came to New York at the turn of the 20th century, he was a person that everybody in New York wanted to have at their dinner table because he spoke, although he was raised in Japan, he wore beautiful Japanese regalia, but spoke perfect English and could quote Shakespeare. He could quote Emily Dickinson. He could burst into song in a moment. And everybody wanted him at their dining table. And women, let me just say, were just infatuated with this man, saying that he was so interesting, so deep, so spiritual, so feminine. This is what every woman wants as a good friend, especially in New York at the turn of the 20th century. One of his great friends and colleagues was the American artist John Lafarge. And here in Seattle, by the way, at the Seattle Art Museum, you have a stained glass window by John Lafarge in there. So John Lafarge was making stained glass before Tiffany was. He also did all of the murals and some of the stained glass in the Trinity Church in downtown Boston that you see here. He became friends of Okakura Kakuzo, and in the late 1880s, John Lafarge, Okakura Kakuzo, and Henry Adams, great-grandson of President John Adams, all took a trip to Japan, and their guide was Okakura. So when John Lafarge returned from his year-long trip to Japan, and Okakura had introduced him to Japan and to the spirit of art and tea. He was so enthralled by what he learned and how it changed his life as an artist that John Lafarge came back and wrote a book called An Artist's Letter from Japan. And he writes this beautiful dedication at the beginning, dedicated to Okakura Kakuzo. It says, "Okakura-san, I wish to put your name before these notes written at the time when I first met you because the memories of your talks are connected with my liking of your country and its story, and because you were Japan to me. I hope that some thoughts of yours will be detected in what I write. As a stream runs through grass, hidden perhaps, but always there." What a beautiful dedication this was. Wouldn't you love to say, when you come to the end of your life, somebody might get up and say, you know, this person's influence ran through my life, hidden perhaps, but always there, like a stream runs through grass. So today we're going to see how that stream ran through the lives of artists in tea people across the world. Okakura wrote the Book of Tea first in 1906. It was his third book. Although he was Japanese, he wrote all three books in English. And often people will think that the Book of Tea must have been written in Japanese and then it was interpreted into English. No, if you find a Japanese edition of the Book of Tea in Japan, it was done the other way around. It was interpreted from the original English. And when he made his dedication of this book in 1906, he dedicated it to John Lafarge, teacher. So when I decided to redo the Book of Tea a few years ago, I wanted to begin with the corpus of the book. So the interior of the book is the same. It's just been cleaned up a little bit as it's laid out text-wise on the page. And we've illustrated all of the chapters, but the chapters remain the same. But the first portion of the Book of Tea now is the story of Okakura Kakuzo. And then I added a third chapter, which talks about the love of Japanese tea in American culture at the end of the 1800s. Here's if you want to file this fact away, put it in the back of your mind, that at least 40% of the tea that was consumed in America by 1890 came from Japan. Was it black tea? No. It was green tea or oolong. 40% of the tea in America at the turn of the century came from Japan. And it came, why? Because it came from Yokohama to the port here in Seattle or to San Francisco in 18 days because of this new invention, which is called the steamboat. So you had boats that were no longer powered by sail. They were powered by huge paddles on the side. It only took 18 days for the tea to get to the Americas. And then we had, guess what? We had railroad tracks going across America. So every general store in America, right after the American Civil War, was having Japanese tea to be bought. Let's look at the opening of Japan, which happened in 1853 because of Commodore Perry. This was the time of the whaling ships. So we had a lot of American whaling ships that were going around Japan. Japan was completely closed society. You couldn't just pull into the port of Edo and restock. If a fisherman or a sailor from Japan was lost at sea, he couldn't get picked up and taken back to Japan because he would be considered unclean at that point. He had visited outside of Japan and he would bring back impure ideas. So Japan was completely a closed society. And then Commodore Perry arrives in 1853 and opens up the port of Edo. That was a major turning point for Japan. And within a few years, you had the capital moved into Edo, which then became the city we know now as Tokyo. So that was the opening of Japan. When this happened, Japan completely turned its back on its history and was looking towards the West for influence. And they wanted to embrace everything in Western society. So in 1862, during the height of the American Civil War, you have this young man born in Yokohama to a family that ran a silk shop in Yokohama, just as everything was opening up for trade. And this man's name was Okakura Kakuzo. Okakura's father needed someone to talk to all the Westerners who were coming in to buy silk from his shop. So he sent his two sons off to the missionary school that had just been established there so that they could learn English. So in the morning, Okakura Kakuzo, at age 6 and 7, was learning the Methodist hymns and studying the writings of St. Paul. But in the afternoon, he was going to Confucius school and drinking green tea and learning to play Japanese instruments. So literally from the time he was 6, he was walking with one foot in the East and one foot in the West. He could speak English as well, or even better, than he could speak Japanese. At this time, Japan wanted to start their first university. And so the Tokyo University began, and they decided to get all of their faculty from the West, and even more specifically from Boston. More specifically, most of them faculty were Harvard trained. And so this is Ernest Fenollosa, who in 1878 became the professor of philosophy at Tokyo University. Okakura, being very smart, a great student, at age 16 entered Tokyo University. Now, it's a great idea to have these Westerners come in to teach your Japanese students, but the only problem is, can you see this coming? Yeah, there's a language difficulty, right? None of these professors spoke Japanese. So the professor Fenollosa asked Okakura, 16 years old, to come and stand next to him as he gave his lectures and then interpret his lectures to his students. When they were finished with their coursework during the week, Fenollosa, being a great art collector, had Okakura take him to all the different shrines and temples across Japan, in Kyoto, in Uji, to discover the great relics that were housed in those wonderful temples and shrines. Because the temples and shrines were having a very difficult time, because everyone was moving away from the Eastern thought, moving more towards Western thought. Literally, things were being pulled out of the temples and shrines to be sold for a pittance, or maybe even burned in a fire, because they thought there's no need for these beautiful things anymore. And so Okakura and Fenollosa went around and bought those things for hardly anything. And then all these pieces were shipped back to Boston, where they were collected at the Museum of Fine Arts. The Museum of Fine Arts in Boston has the largest collection of Asian arts in the world, all because of the faculty at Tokyo University, and a lot of this has to do with Okakura Kakuzo taking them to all these places to find relics and artwork to be sent back. Here you see Okakura in front and center, dressed in Western garb and surrounded by his professors. These are in Kyoto and Uji. These are some of the places that they went. Here you have in the Boston Museum of Fine Arts a few of the pieces that were sent back and that are in their collection today. They have over 50,000 watercolors that were collected to send back there. So they have a huge amount of Asian art, specifically in the watercolors. This was Okakura's tea set that he sent back. Okakura was a great apologist for the ancient spirit of Japan. And as he saw all these things being tossed away, he said, you need to stop, because Asian art is just as important as Western art. And so he, at one point, cast away his Western clothes that he was starting to wear and started wearing, as you see here, Japanese garb as he arrived to teach courses when he became a professor at Tokyo University. And what do you see him riding on? He arrived every morning on a horse, which I'm sure brought attention to many of the students on campus. In America, we think of museums because we've had the idea of museums for well over 2 centuries. In Japan, there was no concept of museum. Why would you take all these beautiful things and put them into one big building? If you want to experience great art, you go to where it was meant to be. You go to the shrines and you go to the temples. But Okakura helped put together the very first museum in Tokyo, which you see there. The National Museum is there today, all because of him. He was so important in Japanese culture that in 1952, they put his picture on the front of a stamp. Here comes a very pivotal point for America. This is where it all takes place. And that was the 1893 Chicago World's Fair. This was a time when the Industrial Revolution was at its height, and America was showing off all of its new electrical items, its Otis elevators, all the things that made living in the West more exciting, they thought, and more industrious. Here you see in 1893 the World's Fair being built, and in the front center you see the Japanese exhibit sitting on an island, and in the pavilion they put in there was modeled after this. This is the Ho'oden, which is one of the most important buildings in Japan. I was just there back in March. So Okakura thought, well, if we're going to, he helped design this exhibit for the World's Fair. He said, if we're going to put something out there, let's show them what we were doing back in the 12th century. And look at this beautiful building that we were building. And so here it is. Here's the original back in Uji, a Buddhist temple from 11th century. This building is so important that it's on the back of a 10-yen coin in Japan. This is the interior of that beautiful building, because he wanted to show that Asian art was just as important as art in the West. 4 of the panels from that building are today installed at the Art Institute in Chicago, the only remaining pieces from that beautiful exhibition from 1893. Now, at this exhibition in 1893, there was a young architect who was studying in Chicago, who happened to see, for his first time, Japanese architecture, up close and personal. And his name was Frank Lloyd Wright. He was in his 20s. Frank Lloyd Wright was just about to start off on his own. And look what he starts to build in Chicago before the turn of the 20th century. Does this look like a typical prairie house from the Midwest? It has a little bit of Asian, Japanese influence to it, doesn't it? Yes. So Okakura was influencing Frank Lloyd Wright at that time. This is a beautiful woodcut from the 19th century Japan. And what you notice about this is the beautiful dominant color is blue. It's Prussian blue. Frank Lloyd Wright was a big collector of woodcut prints, and he used that same idea in some of his drawings, such as this sketch for one of his buildings as well. All right, let's go back to Boston. So, one of the things that I do, I'm the tea master for the city of Boston for the museum that interprets the Boston Tea Party. I taught a class back in January called the Second Boston Tea Party. So I want to introduce you to the Second Boston Tea Party, which started in 1904, which was when Okakura arrived in Boston and met the belle of Back Bay, Boston, Isabella Stewart Gardner. Anybody here been to the Stewart Gardner Museum in Boston? Yeah, it's one of the top 2 art museums there. I suggest that you see it if you're in Boston. She was born in 1840 in New York. She was a childhood friend of Henry James. They lived just around the block from each other. And you remember Henry James put one of the most important quotes about tea in one of his books, The Portrait of a Lady. Everybody wanted to be at Isabella's table. She was one of the wealthiest women in Boston, and she was a big art collector as well. Her friends included people like Richard Strauss, Johannes Brahms, Henry James, Henry Adams, anybody who was anybody, John Singer Sargent. They all came through Isabella's home. John Singer Sargent, one of her greatest friends, and Sargent even painted her 3 times. The first time he painted her was this painting right here. What do you notice about what's behind her head? Not very typical for a Western painting. It's like a mandala is behind her head. And this is the wallpaper that she was standing in front of. When her husband saw that painting, he said, we can't really show that in public for a couple of reasons. You have that Buddhist mandala behind your head. The other thing is you have way too much décolletage going on there. So this was a scandalous painting that she tucked away in a closet for years until Okakura discovered it there one day and said, Isabella, you really should put this out so everybody can see it. So it's now one of the most famous paintings in the Gardner Museum when you go there. This is her court. She was a great fan of Venice, so when she built her new house museum that you can visit today in Boston, it resembles a palazzo in Venice, filled with spectacular paintings. Well, now let's get to how Okakura gets here. So in 1904, Okakura comes to Boston. He comes via New York City, and he is on his way to Boston to become the Asian Arts director at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. Now you remember, years ago, he and Fenollosa and the professors had all been collecting all this stuff in Japan, sending it to Boston. It's all there now. It needs to be cataloged and put into the new museum. So they invite him to become the new director of the Asian Arts collection in Boston. He comes through New York. He makes the front page of the New York Times, as you see here. And so on March 24th, 1904, there's a mysterious man who appears at Isabella Stewart Gardner's front door holding a note from our friend John Lafarge. And it says, I should like to add my knowledge that you may have of him, my statement that he is the most intelligent critic of art, and I might also say of everything that I know of. I think he is one of the few persons whom you should not miss enjoying. And they did enjoy each other's company for many years after that. What a great letter of introduction this was from John Lafarge. And so Okakura and Gardner were much together for years to come. These are a few of the pieces that Okakura sent to Isabella. This is a very important story in Isabella's life, because in about 1908, there was a box that arrived from Japan. Okakura had gone back to Japan, and he had put together a few things to send to Isabella. So she opens up this wooden box, and in it were a lot of tea things, including, as you see here on the right, a tea bowl that was cracked and repaired. And she got this out and she said, oh, why has Okakura sent me this old cracked tea bowl? She didn't understand the concept of kintsugi, which is the idea that something can be broken and put back and it can be more valuable in its repair than it was when it was originally in its perfect form. And in Japan, what do? They emphasize the brokenness with what? Well, often with gold paint. And so this bowl, because it is broken and repaired, is much more valuable than it would have been if it was just unbroken. He sent this as a lesson to his tea student, Isabella, that because Isabella had lost a child at 4 years old, her only son died of flu, and she never was over that. She was broken. And so he was trying to influence her to say, even in your brokenness, you can be valuable. These pieces today are in Boston to be seen. Okakura arrived just as the Boston Museum of Fine Arts was leaving their old location downtown and moving out to their new location, which you will see if you go to Boston to the Museum of Fine Arts. And as they set up this museum, Okakura Kakuzo, the author of the Book of Tea, was one of the people who designed how the layout of this museum would be. No small matter, because from then on, museums around the world looked to the Museum of Fine Arts as they laid out their collections. These are just a few of the things that are in Boston that were touched by Okakura. And I had an opportunity to teach a college class in January, and we took 21 students to Boston for 3 days and went into the archives and had an opportunity to be up close and personal with these beautiful pieces, such as The Great Wave, which is now in the new edition of the Book of Tea. So let me just finish by talking about the first chapter of the book, which is humanity has met in a teacup. A story I often talk about. Because Okakura, as he was in Boston, they were looking through this collection of things, and the docents and the volunteers were there cataloging these pieces, and they would say to him, sometimes they would hold up a little Kuan Yin and say, Okakura, tell us about this Kuan Yin, or this statue, or this scroll. And he would recite the poem for them, or sing a song about that beautiful piece. And so he made each one of these pieces in the collection come to life. And sometimes he would make little notes before he went in and talked to the volunteers there. And when he finished his notes, he would just toss them into the trash can. Fortunately, a volunteer would come by and pick those up and collect them. And so now we have those notes in the Book of Tea because somebody salvaged those from the garbage can. So people were often saying, Okakura, why are you so different? You have such a beautiful life. There's a spirit. We just want to be around you. What causes that? So he then decided, well, like Jesus, he then tells a story. He says, okay, you drink tea, I drink tea. Your cup has a handle, my cup doesn't have a handle. When you drink tea in a tea room, it might look like this, frilly and frou-frou. When I drink tea in a tea house, it looks like this, plain and minimal. But we both drink tea. Let's start our conversation over the commonality we have, over tea. And so he says that tea has met then in a teacup. Let's begin the conversation there. He goes on to talk about the tea room being a bare stage. And my wife and I ran a tea house for 14 years. And we often said that we treated, even before I read Book of Tea, I understood that tea was a play that it was reenacted every day. We would set the stage. We were the directors, but who were the actors? Were the people coming into our tea room. So no 2 days were exactly alike. We would set this empty stage and see what was going to happen with a different cast that came in every day. And that's the same thing that happens in a tea room. So, you know, often in the tea room, you'll have a scroll that will have the words Ichigo, Ichi-e on it, which is so important for the Japanese tea ceremony. Ichigo, Ichi-e means basically this moment will never come again. It's unique. Anytime we're here together for tea, honor it because it will never happen this way again. And so Okakura talks about it being the abode of vacancy. It's this empty space that we then bring in the creative spirit. So he says the simplicity of the tea room and its freedom from vulgarity make it truly a sanctuary from the vexations of life. Frank Lloyd Wright, who had 2 copies of the Book of Tea, went on to say, when he designed, he eliminated the insignificant. What a great concept that is. And of course, I'm going to bring it even more contemporary to Marie Kondo, right? Which is just tidying up. We need to get rid of some things in our life. So what often we teach in our classes is that if you come to a tea master and bring your cup, and your cup is full, the tea master can put nothing into your cup. You have to empty your cup in order to refill it. So, and often I have students who come to me trying to find the way, their way through the way of tea, but their cup is already filled with so many things. And they can't continue further on the way of tea until they take the cup and empty it out. And that's what we sometimes need. It's the abode of vacancy, Okakura would say. Frank Lloyd Wright in the 1920s said he received a little book by Okakura Kakuzo entitled The Book of Tea. It was sent to him by the ambassador. And in that, he says, he points out this quote, "The reality of a room is to be found in the space enclosed by the roof and the walls, and not in the roof and the walls themselves." He thought that was so important, he engraved it into the wall at Taliesin West for all of his art and architecture students to see. Meaning that, yeah, you can build this space, but it has to be empty, and that it will not be completely finished until something comes and fills that space. But you must have this abode of vacancy. It comes from the Tao Te Ching by Lao Tzu. So it came through Lao Tzu to Okakura. Okakura then taught it to Frank Lloyd Wright. And you see that whenever you go into a Frank Lloyd Wright house. Well, Okakura continued to be friends in Boston, and Isabella considered him to be her great spiritual advisor. And anytime there was a dinner party, he was at the table. As a matter of fact, I was sitting at that table just a few months ago in the Gardner Museum up on the top floor at the very table where Okakura and Isabella had tea quite often. In 1913, Okakura went back for the 8th time to Japan, and he went to his favorite little retreat, which is north of Tokyo, and it's close to Fukushima. And you know what happened in Fukushima in 2011 with the tidal wave that came in. And he had his little hut there on the sea. This hut was almost destroyed during the tidal wave in 2011 and has been rebuilt. But he went back there for the final time in 1913. He was still in his 50s, not an old man, but he was not feeling well. And this is where he died. This is also where he wrote the Book of Tea back in 1906, was at this little hut. And you can go there to visit that today. So he died there in 1913. A telegram came from his brother to Isabella Stewart Gardner and said Okakura had died, and she was just despondent for almost a year. She went into depression because her great spiritual advisor had passed away. The Museum of Fine Arts was so indebted to what he had done with them that they built a Japanese garden on the grounds of the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston and called it Tenshin Garden. Because if you ask people in Japan, if you know Okakura Kakuzo, they say, I don't know who Okakura Kakuzo is, but they know Okakura Tenshin, which was his Buddhist name that was given to him after he died. So this is the Tenshin Garden. So we go back just to finish with our good friend Georgia O'Keeffe. This is one of my favorite photographs of Georgia O'Keeffe. What do you notice about this is how calm, serene, how balanced she looks. She even went, in her later years, would wear a Japanese gown like this, always in black, very simple. And I had the opportunity a few years ago to talk with a woman who sat with Georgia O'Keeffe the last 2 years of her life. Because by her 90s, she had lost her eyesight. She couldn't paint. She couldn't even read. So she would have people come in to sit with her. Christine Patton sat with her for 2 years. And often she would say to Christine, would you pull down the Book of Tea and read to me from his Okakura's article about flowers or the different aspects of tea. And Christine said this to me: the similarities between her own life and the Japanese tea ceremony were obvious. Her constant manner, her humility, her exactness, her utterly respectful exactness. And you see it even in her face. Again, going back to our friend Lafarge, he writes, like a stream through grass, hidden perhaps, but always there. The stream continues to run through not just an architect like Frank Lloyd Wright, but also through this very important painter of the 20th century, even into our lives today, hidden perhaps, but always there. And what do we call it? We call it the way of tea. It is that way. So people often ask me, well, how did you get into tea? And I often say, this is not an intentional thing for me. I just put one foot on this path and started walking. And then occasionally I'll look back and I can see my footprints where I've been, and I continue walking. I don't know where I'm going on this path, but I know it's a beautiful path. I love being on it, and it makes a great adventure in my life, and I'm going to continue that. It's part of the beautiful foolishness of things. It's a very romantic idea, but it's what brings all of us into the way of tea. So let us dream of evanescence. It's going to be there for a moment maybe and gone, but we'll linger in the beautiful foolishness of things. So we'll take a moment for any questions that you might have about the Book of Tea. Anybody? Yes? Okay. The question is, how did I go about picking the illustrations for this book? You know, the original book had maybe just a few line drawings, and that was pretty much it. So Okakura was a big proponent of Japanese art, and he wanted to let people know that Japanese art was just as important as Western art. So I took the 36 Views of Mount Fuji by Hakusai, one of the most important collections in Japanese art history, and I pulled out several of them, especially the ones that had maybe a tea scene in them, and used those as dividers for the different chapters. So that's pretty much how it came about. So this was a nod to Okakura's love of Hakusai as well, including, you know, the Great Wave, which everybody knows that one. Yeah. Other questions? Well, thank you very much for being a great audience, and if you want to come by and talk more at my booth, you know where I am, up here on booth number 2. So thank you.